C++ is a very successful language. And as C++ developers, that might be one of our biggest challenges. The existing C++ code line in the world is huge. Billions of lines of code written over decades, which run our planes, our cars, our phones, our banking systems. Everything uses C++. This existing code line is incredibly valuable. On the other hand, the C++ language is evolving very quickly. We are in an online C++ conference because we want to learn about new patterns and new features that just arrived. And we have to reconcile having a pretty old legacy code line that is extremely valuable and wanting to use new features, more secure patterns, etc. That's a question that really interests me. I work at Murex, a company that does software for capital market. It has been doing so for the last 38 years. And on my desk, I have this book. It's a documentation of the API I maintain. This is a UI API for the main application from Murex. And this documentation was printed June 3rd of 1994. That's probably not the first documentation ever written about this library. And so you can understand that clearly the code I maintain was started a long time ago and has evolved a lot in the meantime and is used by a lot of different developers. So I cannot just rewrite everything from scratch. And I also want my API to be as modern as possible. How can I do that? How can I reconcile having old code with refactoring, modernizing, and cleaning? First thing I did was look at the history of cleaning to see if I could learn something. I did. So first thing, yes, this advertising is very misogynistic. That's not the point. The point is we are in the 50s, after the Second World War, and Hoover and a few other companies are trying to sell this new tool, a vacuum cleaner. With a vacuum cleaner, you can clean a carpet in a few minutes when it used to take a lot of time to do it before. And so they said, oh, thanks to that, people who clean the houses will have a lot more free time for themselves. Which is not what happened. What happened instead are two different things. The first one is we completely redefine what was expected from a carpet. Before vacuum cleaners, if you wanted to clean all the carpets in your house, it would take you a day. So you would do it once every 2 weeks or once a month. So a clean carpet was a carpet that was cleaned during the last 2 weeks. With a vacuum cleaner, you can clean all your carpets in 1 hour. So if you didn't do it today, that was dirty. So we completely redefined what was a dirty vacuum cleaner. What was a dirty carpet. The second thing that happened is that it allowed the operation of a new way to decorate houses, which is whole floor carpentry. You cannot have whole floor carpentry if you don't have a vacuum cleaner to clean it. So they were trying to sell this new tool by thinking that it would just simplify life of people. And instead, it redefined what was a clean carpet and allowed the operation of a new way to decorate houses. And if I talk to you about that, it's because this kind of tools that you think at first sight are going to just simplify life and instead completely redefine how we work, it happens quite a lot. An example I like is Git. Before Git, there were other version control tools, and a few of them had this idea of branching. Except branching was taking your whole repository and copy it in a second folder, and that was a branch. you would copy everything. It would take a few minutes or perhaps an hour if your repository was very big. Then arrived Git, which branches instantaneously by just creating a new tag. And for somebody who's been branching by copying everything, it seems like it will just be slightly faster, but anyway, you don't branch that much. You branch once a month, perhaps. Except once that instantaneous branching appeared, new workflows appeared with it. And now, if you use Git in your day-to-day jobs, chances are you're probably branching multiple times a day instead of once a month. So instead of making life slightly faster once a month, we completely redefine our workflows around this new tool. And my opinion is that ClientID is one of those tools which we are going to redefine everything we do around this new tool. If you think about it, before ClientID, if you wanted to refactor, your refactoring was basically on a scale, with on one hand, the boilerplate rule. You always leave the code in a better state than you found it. So I'm fixing a small bug. I'm also going to rename unclear functions around the bug I'm fixing. I'm going to remove row loops and replace them with STD algorithm where it makes sense. I'm going to simplify the code in general as much as I can in these functions I'm changing to fix the bug. That's very useful. I love the boilerplate rule, and especially because it's very powerful on hotspots of the code. This part of the code that you touch every time there is a new issue and that you modify a lot, those are where you're going to refactor the most and make the simplest code, which is where you want to have the simplest code. It's also part of the business as usual. You never need to ask the authorization to have some time to refactor with the boilerplate rule. You just do it. It's very short anyway. It's very easy to merge. You were going to merge a fix in a function. The fact that you changed it a little bit more, it's not going to change drastically how easy it is to merge it in your main branch. But it also has downsides. It's not convenient for widely used APIs. If I'm changing a function that is called by hundreds of modules, I'm not going to rename the function because that would require me to change hundreds of modules instead of just one function. So that's not where I should do it. It's also not convenient for risky refactorings. I am trying to fix a bug. I do a little bit of refactoring at the same time, but I'm not going to take the risk of adding a new bug. So I'm not going to do anything risky there. And it's not the right place for what I call coordinated refactorings. Refactorings where the company goes and say, okay, now we are going to do things this way, and we want the whole code line to evolve in this direction. With the boilerplate rule, you're going to fit the hotspots, but some files will stay untouched for years. So if you really want a refactoring on the whole code line, that's not through the boilerplate rule. On the other hand, of the other side of the scale, you have what I call the golden boy refactoring. And the golden boy, it's when you go see your boss and you say, boss, I have this problem and I think we should spend some time fixing it. And your boss say, okay, stop everything you're doing and refactor. You have unlimited budget. If you can have that, that's fantastic. You will be able to tackle very complex refactorings, and it could lead to great improvements for all the users of your API. But it will also probably be extremely repetitive. If you have hundreds of files calling this function and you need to rename it, it will be exciting for the first file you change because you're doing something new, and then you have hundreds of files where you're going to do exactly the same thing. It's also very error prone. You might do a typo, and if you're very unlucky, perhaps the typo is also compiling. And finally, the biggest problem is that it's a whack-a-mole. you are trying to fix problems, but the rest of the company is still working and might be adding new problems as you fix them. And the worst case scenario is if they add them faster than you remove them, in which case you will never finish your golden boy refactoring. Everything on this scale makes sense. It makes sense to do boisterful refactoring. It makes sense to sometimes stop everything and work on this huge manual refactoring. But there is definitely room for something new and outside of the scale, which for me is Client ID. If you don't know anything about Client ID, it's a linter tool for C++. It will statically analyze the code and sometimes automatically fix the issues it finds. And it's built on top of Clang, which is a C++, C, and Objective-C compiler. How it works is it takes your code, it generates an AST, an abstract syntax tree, and then it does some magic on the AST and generates code for your target. The interesting part here is the AST. If you've never seen some AST, it looks like that. So I have this code. It's just one file with one function called getAnswer. And for Clang, this is a translation unit declaration with one child, which is a function declaration, with one child, which is a compound statement, everything between braces. And this compound statement has two children, a declaration and a return statement. That AST representation, a lot of compilers use it. What makes Clang pretty unique is that for each node of the AST, Clang knows where in the original text file this node was, the beginning and the end of the node, line 1 to line 4. And that is something really, really huge, in fact. So if we go back to this chart, the arrows go both ways, from the EST to the Objective-C, C++, and C, and from the C++, C, Objective-C to the EST. That's where we're going to build tools like Client ID. Client ID is going to search the EST tree, the EST, for specific nodes, and when it finds one, it's able to act on the original text file that generated this node in the EST. For example, you could search for all the 4 nodes which use the old iterator syntax and instead use for range based loop. That is like 100% what you want to do. It makes it more readable. It makes it absolutely clear that you're crossing the whole container and just not part of it or anything. And it is automatic. You have nothing to do. Client ID is going to do it for you. It could also search for auto pointer nodes, and every node where you assign this auto pointer node to some other value, and it can replace all of them automatically with unique pointer nodes and move instead of assignments, which is really great because most of the time this can be slightly dangerous to do as part of the boisterful tool. Like if it's used just in one function, it's pretty easy, but as soon as you start moving around and resetting the unit pointer, you're very happy to have somebody doing it automatically for you instead of taking risks. All of that is very nice and really help us, but it's not what's going to change our lives. What did change my life is that Client ID has a C++ API for writing new checks. So not only am I going to have these rules, which are very generic and apply in most of the C++ code lines, but I can also write rules for my specific problems and my specific refactorings. This is done by overriding just 2 functions. One is register matcher. This is where I'm adding matchers for specific AST nodes that I'm looking for. And then every time Client ID is going to find one of those nodes, I'm going to be told on check where I can react to matching the node. I could react in a lot of ways. I can modify the original code, but I can do other things like perhaps I want to count something or perhaps I want to create an index of something. I can do a lot of things with just that. So this is the theory. In practice, what could I do? First example I have, I was talking with somebody who was part of a team who had moved from using double ampersand to using AND in all letters in their AND operations. These are the same in C++. You can use double ampersand, you can use AND. It's exactly the same for the compiler. Some people find that using all letter AND is more readable. Problem this person had is that they had moved from double ampersand to AND mid-project. So they had a mix of double ampersand and AND, which is bad. And they couldn't change it manually because the project was already too big to do it manually. And you cannot use the regex because you would also catch R-value references and forwarding references, which are also double ampersand. And interesting trivia, if you replace R-value references with AND in all letters, it's going to compile still. But that's not what you want. It would be completely unreadable and extremely confusing for everybody. So they were stuck. Couldn't use regex, couldn't do it manually. I talked with this person and said, I'm pretty sure that client ID could do it very quickly. And so we wrote this rule. We register one matcher, which is a matcher for binary operators whose name is double ampersand. That's it. I'm going to attach a name to this specific node of the AST. I'm calling it myop. Now client ID is going to search the whole AST of the code, and every time it finds a node that is a binary operator with the name double ampersand, I'm going to be called on check. And in check, first thing I do is get back this node I called myop. And from that node, I'm going to get the operator location, which this is a back arrow from the EST node to the original C++ file. I'm attaching a diagnostic to this location, saying double ampersand can be replaced by AND. I also attach a fixit, saying, okay, we can replace this double ampersand with AND. A fixit is how client ID is going to fix automatically the issue. And it's also going to display a nice message telling you how you could fix it by hand if you want, like that. So here I run my new rule on a file that luckily has a double ampersand on the second line. And I have this message, demo.cpp line 2 colon 12, warning double ampersand can be replaced by AND. And then it displays the text and the fixit it proposes, which is to remove 2 characters and add AND instead. That's it. This person just had to run this script on this rule on their whole code line, and in one blink of an eye, their whole code line was using AND in all letters everywhere where it made sense. Another example is one I had in my job. We had this method called displayString, which anybody can call to display a new string. It takes a name, a parameter, and then an unused parameter. And this parameter has been unused for at least 16 years. My version control tools cannot go farther than that, so I don't know if at some point it was used. Perhaps it was added by somebody who thought it might be a good idea but never used at all. So the question is, why have this parameter been unused and not removed in the last 16 years? And the answer is very simple. It's because last time I searched, this displayString method was called in 40,000 different files, usually more than once in each file. So nobody is going to go through 40,000 files and remove by hand an unused parameter. With client ID, I was able to register a matcher looking for call expression whose callee was a function whose name was display screen and parameter count was 4. I bind this node to an ID function to clean, and every time client ID finds one of those nodes, I pull down check, where I can get back function to clean, look for the second parameter, the third if you count from 1, attach a diagnostic in the original file at the location of the parameter, saying this parameter is unused, and also attach a fixit, saying we could remove this location. And then I could run this rule on the whole code line and remove the dead parameter from all the 40,000 different files at once in a few minutes. And so I could fix a 16-year-old problem in a few minutes. I think with those two rules, you already see how we can solve issues that we couldn't solve with manual refactoring or regex. I'm going to add another example to show that we can go farther than that. So imagine you have this API that you maintain, and you have an interface called reader, which has one function read. Anybody can override read. It takes a message, and they have to just return this magic number, being 0 on success and 1 on failure. Except we're in 2020, and what we would want is instead to have an enum class, which is readable, success or failure, not just 0 or 1, and you have to guess which means what. This is an interface that we provide, but everybody is overriding it in their own code. If I have access to everybody's code, which happens if it's like a huge software, I can read their code. It looks, for example, like that perhaps. They have their class SumReader, which overrides read, and has early returns and variables to which they assign values, etc. With client ID, you could search for all the return statements in read. If it returns a literal value, you can just replace it with an enum. If it returns a variable, you could search for all the declaration of variable. Here I'm declaring it at one place. I'm assigning it a numerical value, so I could just replace that with an enum value. I can look for every places where I assign a value, and if it's a numerical value, I can replace it automatically. If it's a function or a variable, I can recurse in this function or variable and change it the same way as I just did, until I find all the original numerical values that are assigned, and I replace all of them at once with an enum class. That's something you could do. The check rule is a lot more complex than just something you want to put in one slide, but you can do it. Proof is I did it in my code. I replaced thousands of, it was not called read, but function like that, and I changed the return value for all of them at once. That is extremely useful because you couldn't do it by hand. If you want to start doing things like that, the starting point for me is this page in LLVM's documentation that lists all the matchers existing. All of them. You just have to know a few starting matchers, like translation unit and core expression. And then you can create your own matcher by just playing dominoes. I know core expression. What is core expression taking as an input? It takes a matcher of core expression. So I go back to LLVM's documentation. I search for all the matchers who return a matcher of core expression. I find the ones that corresponds to what I'm looking for. It's trolley. What does trolley take as an input? A matcher of declaration. Okay, what matcher does return that? Function declaration. And that way, by just searching for all the function returning what you are looking for, you can create your rule without knowing in advance the name of all the matchers you're looking for. After a few times, you start knowing most of those that are very useful. You can also look at Jeremy Dummel's presentation. He presented at CPPP 2019 how to add a new client ID rule by the practice, which was a live coding of a new pretty complex rule, starting from absolutely nothing, presenting how to test it, which tools he uses to prototype it, and how it comes to this pretty powerful rule by the end of the hour. I also recommend looking at Stephen Kelly's work. He has this blog, stevire.wordpress.com. Stephen Kelly has been doing a lot of work for Client ID, which is extremely useful for everybody. And he also did some presentation about the subject. He's very knowledgeable, so you should check it out. And finally, our favorite online tool, Compiler Explorer, also has Client Query. So I didn't present Client Query. It's just a tool to prototype the matchers that you're going to use in Client ID. Instead of writing your matcher immediately in Client ID and having to recompile and test every time you change the matcher, you can just use Client Query to quickly prototype your matcher until it works, and then you can work on the check of your Client ID rule. And luckily, Compiler Explorer does have a Client Query view, which you can find by pressing all the menus and the checkboxes until you have that. Or you can go just to the short URL dotball.org/z/clientquery, which immediately shows you the right layout with everything at the right place and a few examples so that you can start coding instantaneously. I really like this tool to search for new Client Query or Client ID rules. With that, you can start writing your own rules, and you will find that there is another huge advantage to using Client Query over manually refactoring. It's for integration. Imagine you manually refactor a lot of code, and it takes you 1 month. After the month, when you want to integrate your code in the general code line, you're going to have a lot of conflicts, and you will have to fix them all by hand. And if you're unlucky and you broke some tests, you will have to fix it very, very quickly, because as you are trying to fix, other people are adding new problems that you will have to, and new conflicts that you will have to solve by hand. On the other hand, if you work with Client ID, first, you're probably going to take a lot less time, but even if you have conflicts, you don't care. You just take the new code and you rerun your rule. It takes a few seconds, and you have no conflict. If you break a test, you can take as long as you want to fix it, and once it's fixed, you just run the rule again, and it works. And just for that, Client ID is extremely useful. So all in all, Client ID is making some unsolvable problems solvable now. You can refactor at very large scale, tens of thousands of files at once, and you can completely revolutionize your code and change your APIs completely, which is absolutely perfect. There is no problem at all. Unicorns are dancing. Everybody is happy. Thank you. Goodbye. Oh, wait, no. I'm French, so it really hurts me to ask you this, but are you sure you want a revolution? Because in revolution, people tend to be beheaded. Now imagine you work, you come at work in the morning, you synchronize your local changes with the mainstream of your application, and your local code no longer compiles. You search into it. Oh, it's because Fred removed this unused parameter in display screen. I was calling display screen in my local changes. Okay, you have to fix it. You fix it, you're happy, you work, you go on a break, you come back, you synchronize again because you want to really be ahead all the time. And your local changes no longer compile. You look into it, oh, it's because Fred changed the return type of read, so now I have to change all the read method I wrote in my local files. If this happens more and more, guess who's going to guess who you are going to behead at the end of the day? Yes, me. So I don't want that. There is another issue. I told you, yeah, I changed 40,000 files at once. Great, right? Except, who's going to validate a 40,000 files changes? Who's going to give the green light for changing their code when they cannot even see the file in the review tool? Because if your tool is like mine, it displays like 100 files and then ... and you cannot go see a code owner and tell them, okay, I changed your code. You cannot see it in the review tool, but believe me, it will work. So the truth is, for this 40,000 files refactoring, I didn't ask anybody and I sent it to production under the hood, which you should not do at home or at work. Never do it. I will no longer do it in the future, I promise. And it went well, luckily, because it was pretty simple, but that's not the way to do. There is another problem. It's that C++ is hard. That's about it. Actually, with C++20, I think they added new ways to initialize. EST matching is hard. If you ask client ID to give you all the initializations in the code for one type, did you really think about all the different cases you could have? Did you expect to have braces? Because you might have curly braces instead. Did you expect braces or curly braces? Well, bad luck, this time it's default initialization and there is none of those. It's very easy to forget one use case and one way to do that in C++. If you're anything like me, you're going to do a lot of mistakes. The proof is, all the examples I've shown you until there are all wrong. I'm sorry, I didn't try to trick you, it's just that I made mistakes in all of them to begin with. Even the very simple matcher that finds binary operators whose name is $& and replaces them with AND. This one seemed very easy and pretty solid. It's not. There is a first big issue. I told you $& and AND are the same thing for client. It's so much the same thing that actually client doesn't see the difference and also tells you that you should replace AND in all letters with AND in all letters, which makes no sense. Once you've seen that, you can pretty easily fix it. You just, instead of getting the location, you get the location and look into the original source code and see if it was $& or AND in all letters. And if it was $%, you put the diagnostic, otherwise you just ignore it. There is another issue. In C++, you can override $%. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. And the thing is, if you override $%, you lose short-circuiting. Client is going to look at the right-hand side of your operator, even if the left-hand side was true. So for client, this is a completely different node in the AST, which we are not looking for at the moment. So we need to add another node, another matcher for this kind of node. So we add C6 operator call expression whose name is $%. That's very easy. We give it the same ID and then the check is the same. So it's very easy to fix once you've seen it. Display string, it was also pretty solid, but in some part of my code, people call it like that. which, okay, they have this macro false, which is 0. When I ask lang, hey, where is the value of the third parameter? Tell me, hey, it's here. So I say, hey, client ID, remove this third parameter. And it does. And now nothing compiles anymore. That's not very complex. Once you've seen it, you can just fix it. Instead of doing this params get location, I have to search for the file location of the location, which is the place before replacing the macro. It's pretty easy to fix once you've seen it. The enum class conversion, changing returning 0 or 1 to returning an enum class, it did work, I told you, except at first I was looking for any return statement instead inside read, which means I also got those return statement inside lambdas inside read. It's easy to fix. I just have to say, okay, I want a return statement for the function read itself. It's easy to fix when you've seen it. It also mixes badly if you template the class that overrides the interface, which I didn't expect to see, but I did see it. I only see it in 2 or 3 different places in the code, so I changed them manually. I didn't update the rule, but if you see it, you're good, but you have to see it. All of those are very easy to fix once you've seen that they are there, which is easy if you have a 1 file change list, and is impossible if you have a 40,000 files change list. If you are lucky, your 40,000 files change list is not going to compile, and you're going to see the error in advance. If you are unlucky, your customer is going to see it, and that's not good. Changing 40,000 files at once, I was very proud of doing it. I felt very powerful. I should probably have thought about whether or not I should do it, which is no. You should not do huge change lists like that. That breaks everybody's code because you can. Instead, what you could do is have an incremental approach to the problem. Instead of removing the unused parameter in all the files at once, I can just introduce this new function that does the same as before with one less parameter. I move all the code in it, and the old function is just going to wrap the new one. I do that in my file. It breaks nobody's code. Everybody is happy. Then I can go through the code, file by file, or chunk of files by chunk of files, and replace the display screen in those. And every time I replace one display screen, it doesn't break the code of anybody else's display screen. I can do it at my own rhythm until one day there is nobody calling the old display screen method, and I can remove it completely. That way I reach exactly the same result without breaking anybody's code. And it's not very complex. Here. In some other cases, it's way more complex. For example, this reader example I showed you. I don't want to return an int, I want to return an enum class. I cannot duplicate read because I cannot have 2 functions with exactly the same signature except for the return type. What I can do is add a read_enum function that returns an enum. Here you notice read is still pure abstract, and read_enum is just virtual and empty to begin with. What I can do now is go in somebody else's code. This person is overriding read. I can replace that with read_enum with a new implementation which returns an enum, and read is only going to wrap read_enum. That doesn't break anybody's code. Everybody is happy. If nobody is overriding some reader, or I've already fixed all the classes overriding some reader, I can add final. That way, I'm sure that nobody is going to go after that and override read again. So everybody is going to override read_enum instead. And they are all working in the right direction, which is using this new read_enum function. One day, every people overriding reader will have been changed to use readenum. And I can go back to my interface and remove read. And now I make readenum the new pure abstract class, pure abstract function. I'm almost there, except it's called readenum. I wanted it to be called read, which I can do by introducing a new function that is called read and returns the result, because now I no longer have any function called read returning an int, so I'm good. And then I just have to do what I just did, but in the other direction. That's a lot of additional steps. That's more complex. But at no point in history am I breaking anybody's code, which is good. This incremental approach is more work, sometimes slightly more, sometimes a lot more. And it gets worse, because it will also add new questions and new problems, like, what is the pull request size now? Because I said I don't want to send one pull request with 40,000 files. I don't want to send 40,000 pull requests with one file in each, right? So I will have to think about what is the right pull request to send to people. I don't have an easy answer for you. It will depend on your company, how many people are reviewing, how much time do they have to review, how complex is your refactoring? Is it just removing the parameter? Probably people can review hundreds of those very quickly. Or is it something complex where you change the types and stuff like that, in which case people want probably to read it in much more detail and make sure that there is nothing wrong going on. Every time you do a new automated refactoring, you will have to think about this question. Another problem you will have is that you need to automatize everything. The whole workflow has to be automatized, because if I don't create one pull request with 40,000 files, I'm going to create perhaps 400 pull requests with 100 files. I cannot create 400 patches by hand one by one. I cannot send 40,000 pull requests to reviewers by hand. I cannot merge them once I receive the green light. So everything has to be automated. And I would recommend to do it sooner rather than later. Like if you have 20 pull requests, perhaps you could do it by hand, but it's probably a good idea to start already automatizing so that you don't have to pay for a manual price, then pay for the automatization. This one, you will have to pay it once, and perhaps you're very lucky and work in a company that already automatized everything, in which case, congratulations. Another thing is, how do I make sure that I don't end up in this whack-a-mole that I talked about for the Golden Barrel refactoring? How do I make sure that other teams are not going to work in the opposite direction of what I'm trying to do? How do I make sure that they don't call display screen with 4 parameters when there is a method with 3, while I try to remove the calls on the 4 parameter ones? So one approach is to use deprecated, which you can do if you don't work with warning as errors. Otherwise, you don't. If you make this deprecated an error, you might just as well change everything at once. If you cannot, a very useful tool that you could try is called client ID. Yeah, where are you think? You could use client ID for your pull request. You can run client ID just before the pull request, just after the pull request, and compare. And if there is any new warning, you can say, okay, the pull request is refused automatically. And then you add in this client ID a rule saying you do not add a new call to display screen with 4 parameters, for example. And that's something that can be very useful, because you can also add other rules, more general rules, saying, okay, I don't want to see this and that pattern in my code, so I'm automatically refusing any pull request with those. People will have to feel the issue before I review it even. I definitely recommend adding client ID to your pull request. And finally, you need to finish your refactoring, and that one is extremely important. If you take an incremental approach, for all steps between the first and the last one, the complexity is bigger than it used to be. You now have multiple functions, and people have to decide which of those multiple functions they want to call. And perhaps they have functions with names that are not perfect because the perfect name was already taken for another return type. For all of those reasons, you have increased the complexity temporarily, which is completely okay as long as it's temporary. Thing is, it's very exciting to start working on a new rule. It's not exciting to follow up and make sure that it reaches its end. So some people will just start working on a rule, do the first steps, then move to a new rule, and start a few steps, and end up with a code whose complexity has exploded because of that. And that's the opposite of what you want. Rather not refactor than add temporary complexity that stays. So always make sure that you finish your refactoring before starting a lot of new ones. All in all, I think Client ID is going to change our life. But just like the vacuum cleaners didn't make anybody's life easier, I'm not sure Client ID is going to make our life actually easier. It's just going to redefine what we are expected to do and how fast. We will have to think about how to have a sustainable approach to refactoring and not refactor tens of thousands of files at once. Using Client ID, it's also going to reveal problems that were there, but we are too slow in our refactoring to see them. Things like, we take too much time to recompile every time there is a change, or things like that. All of those are good problems to have, but we will have to learn how to fix them. And finally, the vacuum cleaner allows the operation of full floor carpentry, this new way of decorating houses, which nobody saw coming when they created the vacuum cleaners. Right now, I don't know what Client ID is going to allow the operation of, but I'm sure there are things that are going to appear thanks to that. Perhaps new diff tools, perhaps new IDs. I don't know, but we will have exciting things in the future thanks to that. I hope after this talk you're going to go in your job and start refactoring everything without alienating your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. First, perhaps I'll start with a story. I wrote this presentation some time ago, and a few weeks ago I started doing 2 refactorings with my team. And we were thinking, okay, this refactoring is quite big, but using an incremental approach would take a lot more time. So perhaps a good solution would be to just do the refactoring without thinking about anything as fast as we can, and then we send it to production and we completely ignore incremental refactoring. And so we said that, and I thought, perhaps I should add something to this presentation, saying, okay, here are, in my opinion, moments where you want to increment and moments where you just want to run with it and do as fast as possible. I didn't add this part for a very good reason. It's that last week, I think, we had this retrospective on what we had done. And the result of the retrospective was we completely failed at this refactoring, and we should never again try to avoid doing anything incremental. So once again, I really recommend taking an incremental approach. Refactoring as fast as possible and ignoring problems in the future is usually not a good idea. I tried it multiple times and failed multiple times on the same thing. Let's look at the questions now. Perhaps I will start from the bottom by Oliver's 2 questions. First one is, if you know that this Hoover advert is misogynistic, why show it at all? So I did discuss that actually with a few people whose opinion I'm interested in on this kind of subjects. And the consensus was that it did exist, and the example made sense in the overall presentation, and we thought that if presenting it was not done in a complacent way, it should be okay. I hope I didn't hurt too many people. I'm really sorry if I did. Second question was, I'm not very keen, or not question, but I'm not very keen with the numerous references to Boy Scout and Golden Boys either. Yes, that's true. I didn't realize it. I'm sorry. You probably understood that English is not my first language, and I kind of use this Golden Boy and Boy Scout as words whose meaning I don't really think about as gendered. I'm sorry about that too. I'm going to think about how I could update that presentation to avoid that. Thank you. Now, if we go back to the top, Patrick was asking, does the code have to compile with client or client ID first? And the answer is yes and no. You don't have to compile everything with Clang, but you need to have what's called compilation database. So that's just the command line to compile each C file or C++ file you want to compile to be understood by client ID. So it has to be like the file has to be compilable by Clang, but you don't have to evolve your build system to compile with Clang. You just need to be able to generate this compilation DB. You can do it if you have CMake, for example. You can just generate the compilation DB automatically with a flag. For other tools, you have Bear that can take any make file and it will generate the compilation DB automatically. And if you have, for example, Visual Studio, I think you can generate a JSON file which looks a lot like the compilation DB, and then you can just do some treatment to generate it. And with all those ways, you can have some files that allows you to use client ID on it. Client ID just needs to have all the compilation flags and all the include directories. That's all. Second question is, can I write plugins for client ID with this, or do I have to change client ID itself? So all the rules I showed here, I had to change indeed LLVM's code line. Like you download the whole LLVM project and you go in the library containing rules that look like the one you want to create, and you update this library. So yes, you have to compile client ID completely. Once you've compiled it once, the incremental compiling makes it so that it's not that long to generate a new rule to compile again, I mean. Nevertheless, I would definitely recommend to use something like Compiler Explorer and ClangQuery to start prototyping with ClangQuery before writing your client ID rule in C++. With ClangQuery, you're just doing script and you just press enter and have the new result. It's instantaneous. And with Compiler Explorer and ClangQuery, you just type and it compiles as you type. Instead of fixing the code in place, would it be possible to write fixes to a new file? Yes, absolutely. You can completely do that. As I said, in the chat, you can do anything you want, including generating new files for something else. And you can run just client ID. Instead of changing in place, you can generate XML or you can generate diff patches that describe what would be the change, and then you can do anything you want with these diff patches. I don't know if I have a question about that, but okay, these diff patches also solve another problem people usually have. If they run client ID on the whole code line, a lot of header files are shared between all the files. And if you replace them in place, that can be a problem. So generating diff files and then applying all the diff files at the end is a good way to avoid modifying multiple times the same header file. How long do you wait between the incremental steps? If you do all of them at the same day or even the same week, there might be some merge conflicts. Absolutely. And once again, it's a bit like for what is the right pull request size. It really depends on your company. Some companies have a lot of employees, and perhaps they don't merge that often, in which case you perhaps need to wait for a month before moving to the next step. In other places, you have a lot less employees, or perhaps everybody is pushed toward merging very quickly, very often, in which case you might be able to do it once a week, for example. It will depend really on how your company works or your project, if you're doing that in part of the project. So you've refactored your code and it's in a good state. All the tooling you've built for this will be used less and less. I wish, like, if you really end up in this position where you have no idea for new refactorings because your code looks very, very good, some of the tooling will still be useful though. Especially like sending pull requests and having everything automated, it's always useful. If your code is very perfect, you still probably create new features and you're still happy to have this workflow where you press enter once and you don't have to do anything and it will end up in production if everything is great. So for that, clearly, I think it can still be useful even farther down the line. We still have 4 minutes. If you have new questions. So Tina in the chat is saying that ReSharper also runs LangTidy in Visual Studio. So I guess if you look in that direction, you can probably find other ways to also use LangTidy with Visual Studio projects, perhaps without having to modify XML or JSON files to generate the compilation DB. And Michael also says that CLion adds new LangTidy rules every version. So yeah, this kind of rules that can run in your IDE, that's also that can be great. Clearly, C++ is very late compared to some other languages for that, and we can take all the help we can refactoring inline in our IDE. Well, I think with that we're good, unless somebody comes with a new question in the last 2 minutes. Thank you all. I hope you're going to try and write your own rules in the future. I'm very interested if you do, and just send me a message to tell me. Oh yes, Alastair is saying that Titus Winter has a lot of interesting things in his book. I didn't mention him, but it's true that clearly Google and especially Titus teams have been at the front of this, all the thinking around refactoring at large scale. And clearly I'm very inspired by people who were very inspired by Titus. You should definitely read Titus' books. Oh, last question at the last minute. What was the most complex refactoring rule you wrote? So I'm sorry, the answer is I cannot tell you. The most complex refactoring I wrote with part of with two other people. Sadly, I cannot present it publicly. So the second most complex one is definitely the enum return type. The first one is part of a complex tool that is not even, we don't even run with the client ID itself. We just use client libraries and generate a whole independent tool. And with that, thank you.